War. It is a metaphorical spawning site for all manner of conspiracy theories. The United States Armed Forces are no stranger to secret experiments involving highly dangerous technologies. There are glass lakes in deserts in Nevada that stand as a testament to the things that the military experiments with outside of public scrutiny. This is a story about one such experiment. And while this particular story isn't quite about testing atomic bombs in the desert, it certainly had some very unfortunate and frankly grotesque consequences for the crew of one U.S. Navy destroyer escort in late October of 1943. It's said that those who join the military know the risks when they join, but could anyone aboard the USS Eldridge that day possibly have known the grisly fate that awaited them? This is a story that the U.S. military refuses to acknowledge ever happened, a story about an experiment in cloaking, or perhaps even teleportation, gone wrong. This is the story of the Philadelphia experiment. In the late years of World War II, Allied forces struggled to safely transport much-needed food rations, troops, and munitions overseas. Convoys carrying such supplies were often over capacity, and the ships themselves were far past their prime. They were laughably easy targets for German U-boats, as the submarines were far more maneuverable than the near-derelict convoy ships. Even with escorts by Allied Navy vessels which could attack submarines and defend the convoys were still in danger. Though the Navy ships were powerful, they were still less maneuverable than the U-boats. By 1942, this glaring advantage in German submarines had cost the Allied forces heavily. It is said that this cost is what drove American military scientists to seek unconventional methods of dealing with the problem. Unconventional in that most would consider the technologies they sought to be purely science fiction. However, perhaps some of those skeptics might change their tune if they knew the most famous of scientists working with the US military at the time, Albert Einstein. The newest vessels that Albert was alleged to have worked on were a new class of anti-submarine destroyer, deemed escorts. They were like destroyers, and they had the capability of destroying subs, but they were also more maneuverable than they were in the past. Their turning radius had been significantly reduced. However, Albert Einstein was not working on the turning radius of these new boats. He was working on a more secretive project, rendering the US Navy destroyer escorts invisible to enemy submarines, perhaps to the naked eye. Some, however, even believe that to be a cover for the fact that Albert was truly working with the military on a way to teleport vessels. There are even iterations of this story that include Albert having secret motivations of his own which he did not tell the military. Some believe that the genius Einstein was attempting to discover a dimension outside of our own. But as the tale is told, in late October of 1943, at Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, a destroyer escort called the USS Eldridge was the first test subject in a new kind of experimental cloaking mechanism, involving extremely high voltages being generated by wires that ran through the ship. The idea was that the high-voltage wires would dampen magnetic fields generated by the ships as they traveled. In World War II, magnetic mines were common, and this process, called degaussing, was a way to protect ships from such mines. This technology could also be used to detect submarines, which is another obvious reason for this technology to have been employed. However, there are those who believe that the military was experimenting with more than degaussing on that day. The late Carlos Allende, who was allegedly working on a Matson Lines Liberty ship nearby, apparently had a very different story to tell. According to Allende's testimony, the electric currents running through the USS Eldridge enveloped the ship in a thick, greenish haze at first. He said he could feel the power coming from the ship, even from the distance between them. The haze grew thicker and thicker until the Eldridge was completely obscured from sight, and then in a flash, the ship disappeared completely. Allende barely had time to recover from the sight of a US Navy destroyer disappearing before the ship returned, as if it were phasing back into existence, going from solid to transparent, and then finally back to solid again. Far-fetched as this eyewitness report may sound, it goes even further still into a gruesome account of the unfortunate fate met by the crew of men aboard the Eldridge. According to Allende, something had clearly gone wrong with whatever process was being used to render the ship invisible. He could see the sailors on the deck of the Eldridge. Many of them appeared to be unable to free themselves from the metal deck and the structures of the ship. Allende stared harder, and to his utter horror he realized that the men's body parts had become fused to the ship. There were men whose hands had been fused up to their wrists with the steel walls, men whose legs, arms, and even heads were said to have been submerged in the steel deck, as though the men's body parts had been passing through the steel and gotten stuck somehow. The men who remained alive appeared to be in excruciating agony, even the ones who didn't appear to have been melded with the Eldridge. Other stories tell of a deckhand witnessing the Eldridge beginning to rematerialize in the naval shipyard in Norfolk, Virginia. This has led to the theory that Albert Einstein was working on teleporting ships. Alfred Bielek claims to have been on the scientific team working on the project that would come to be known as the Philadelphia experiment. According to him, everyone on the team felt that there was something very wrong about the experiment. The problem, basically, was that the human nervous system could not take exposure to that level of magnetic and electric fields, and it caused neural damage, according to Mr. Bielek. His accounting of the aftermath and its effects on the crew members is more detailed than Allende's, but he tells the same harrowing story. The first thing they found was 2 sailors buried in the steel deck. The bodies were literally buried in the steel, dying or near dead. 2 more were found standing upright in a bulkhead, also buried in the steel. A 5th man with his hand buried in the steel up to his wrist. He says the deceased and surviving sailors aboard the Eldridge were officially classified as lost at sea. The survivors had suffered such serious neural damage that they were institutionalized under different names. The families were never told the truth, continues Bielek. They were told basically that they were lost at sea during the war as a part of the war effort, which of course was a very plausible answer. The experiments were immediately halted and scrubbed from military records after the horrifying results of the first test. To this day, there have been no declassified records released by the US Navy of any Philadelphia experiment ever having been conducted at Philadelphia's shipyard. So what do you think? Was Albert Einstein attempting to implement technology that caused the stunning and gruesome effects reported by Carlos Allende and Alfred Bielek? Did he render the USS Eldridge invisible? Or transport it across the globe at the expense of the men aboard? Was this all just an embellished story made up by someone who had overheard Navy chatter about the process of degaussing and it rendering ships invisible to enemy magnet mines? Was Carlos Allende truly just watching a successful test in degaussing? Or perhaps, as the US Navy maintains to this day, did this event never even happen? I leave that up to you. Thank you for watching and listening.